From distraction to a world. From a messy mind of all sorts of spiraling thoughts and feelings. To a world. This is the process that can happen through meditation and visualization. It is a transformation of our inner worlds from a bit of an uninteresting mess into something that is actually its own place. Although this might be a little bit inaccurate, because as we'll see, this mind world already exists. We just have to have the right tools to see it properly. So here's the sequence of events. We start out with our usual mind. Through focus and noting and naming all of these different things as they arise and pass away, we develop a bit of focus. The distractions are a bit less. They never completely go away. We have some focus energy. And then what? This is still essentially our usual mind, but we have some nice energy. We feel good, probably, maybe. What we need is to bring some structure to all this. We need a reference frame to combine all these different thoughts and feelings into something that our minds can grapple with, something specific, even personified. So instead of a bunch of different random thoughts and energies here, let's bring them together into a vague shape. All of our swirling thoughts, perhaps they have a sort of personality. Perhaps the energy that we develop seems to have its own personality. This is a little hard to explain. This tangled mass of distraction and thought and feeling. The longer that we look at it and just allow it to be, the more it might start to have a certain shape. Could be, in this case, a circle, I suppose. Maybe it has a certain distance from us. How far away is it? Let's get some perspective into this. Is it right up beside us? Is it right here, right in front of our minds? Is it actually a bit larger, farther away? These swirling thoughts, they tend not to be too far away. our minds are very familiar with dealing with what is basically a normal human experience. You know, the human length. This length where most or all of our important experiences happen. So right here might be where, we hold our smartphones. Or here might be where other people generally are. It's close. And if we can realize that our swirling thoughts are sort of nearby, that's an enormous improvement. We already have a frame to be able to encounter them in. We're already starting to put all of our thoughts and distractions into a context without getting rid of them. They're still there. They might not even necessarily be less. And that doesn't actually matter. As long as we can start to bring some awareness to, well, like where they are, then our minds have already started to target in. We are already developing a rather important type of focus. Our attention can become intense and very helpful. The distractions are still there, but our focus is actually quite strong. After that, we can start to add other elements. Other things that you might expect a physical thing to have, and maybe not necessarily expect a mental thing to have. So, distance. Okay, distance. Small and close. Could be rather large, actually. All sorts of options here. There's distance. There's color. Perhaps. That could be anything. Colors are a really important part of feeling. It doesn't matter if you're so-called synesthetic or not. Generally, there's some sort of color involved with these things. And you just have to ask yourself, if this jumble of thoughts had a color or a shape or a distance, what would it be? And funny enough, more often than not, the answer just pops right into your head. You know it immediately. Some part of you just somehow knows, like, of course it's red and about this big and, so far in front of me. And if you can get that answer immediately, then that means you're already pretty much on track. There's really no stopping you now. And the funny thing is that it seems like we all already know all of these different attributes. We just choose not to think about it. Maybe it seems a bit strange or even a bit dangerous to try to invest these swirling thoughts with so much other attributes. Maybe we don't want to give them strength over us. Maybe we're afraid that if we pay more attention or develop them, that the distractions will become even more intense and then we can't even work, or that we'll get lost in it somehow. But at least in my experience, it's exactly the opposite. If you can see more of these details, then you can get a better handle. You can get a much better handle on what you're experiencing. Your mind can say, aha, this is what is happening here. And funny enough, then once you've sort of contained all of these jumbled thoughts, then you can go do something else in the world very happily. Like surfing, I don't know. You can go do something else that takes focus and concentration and attention and passion. you can focus completely on what's happening in the world because we've already sort of, I guess you could say, compartmentalize what's going on here. You know that this is the physical world. This is our world, and this is my mind. Being able to have a bit of a break here is extremely important and very healthy. Because otherwise, these distractions, we start to dwell on them, and a weird thing happens where these distractions can start to seem real in their own way. I don't think I want to get into that now. So once we've contained what it is that's going on, this is our focus. It's our mind's eye. It's what we're paying attention to. There might be things outside of this, I don't know, birds, other people making noise. Who knows, cars. It's terrible. But once we get a sense of this is my mind, and we allow all of our distractions to just be in it, this is actually quite a comfortable and really focused way to engage. It can be quite exhausting to try to X all these distractions out. It's like running a marathon. You're never really going to win. Might as well just, first of all, let them be. Let them be. You're developing a world, after all. And distractions are not particularly important, I suppose, but they build a world. They're the elements. They're the nuts and bolts, or they're the trees and background rocks that populate the world. It's like in a video game. You need assets. You need maps. You need NPCs. You need all sorts of... These are trees starting to come into focus. The richer our internal world is, the more engaged with it we'll be, and the more focus will just come perfectly naturally. In the same way that focusing on a game is completely natural, because it's just, if it's well designed, it's so rich. There's so much there that it feels real, it feels engaging. And the distractions, that's what they're there for. The trick is just to not obsess over one in particular. This might be a thought, a bad memory. See, if we're out in the world and we see a tree, we don't obsess completely over that tree or other just background object. It's just part of the scenery, and we just have to let go, not of the thing itself so that it disappears, but let go of our feeling like, I must obsess over this one thought in particular. Just let it be as it is. It doesn't have to come to dominate everything that we're doing. It's just part of the background, and it can be respected by that, like that. So this is sort of what happens when you start to ask, well, all this swirling thoughts and feelings, if it was a place, where would it be? Now, I live in the woods, so naturally, if I ask myself this question, my distractions typically form themselves into familiar things. Trees and maybe some mountains in the background. And that's fine. It's not like... Well, we'll get into this later, but you don't necessarily have to think of the mind world as its own distinct, separate, real, objective place that's out there in the universe somewhere that we're tuning into, and that everyone else is there too, and they could just tune into the same place. I mean, maybe. There's things to discuss about that. But it's a bit irrelevant if you can't even really see things properly to wonder about like the objective nature of it. I mean, from a purely scientific standpoint, our thoughts and feelings will naturally congeal into what our minds have grown up to be familiar with, our normal surroundings. If I lived in a city, these distractions and whatnot would probably form into their own, some sort of city landscape. And, well, is it real or not? Doesn't matter. That's not the question now. The only concern, is whether we can find a way to form a world which contains all of our thoughts and feelings. Whatever world that might be is perfectly fine. It could be anything that is rich enough to contain all of our experiences. So it can't be simple. You gotta find it, and it usually comes. It'll be something that comes to you. So maybe you want a fascinating forest, jungle, mental landscape, but you see buildings because that's your life. That's okay. We're trying to deal with what is there in our minds, and our minds tell us what is there. And if we don't have that flexibility to just accept whatever landscapes are already present in our minds, then we won't make any progress. You could try to shift your attention away from buildings and try to focus on trees, but now we're just back to the big thing that I'm saying we're not supposed to do, which is getting rid of distractions. There is something to be said for generating your own landscapes like the Tibetan methods do, and we'll get to that. What I'm trying to describe now is a very different process, which is not very well described most places, where you just let it form naturally. And the advantage to this is that this is already there. This is already in our minds. We already have a fantastically rich landscape, and we know exactly what it is. Everyone that I talk to, well, most people, when I ask them like what is in your mind, well, they have an immediate answer. We all know. We all intuitively know. And if we don't, well, that's fine. I'm speaking mostly to people that recognize what I'm trying to get across, but don't necessarily have the words for. Or maybe if you practice one way for a long time and you start to get a strange sense of something you can't really describe but feels like a massive distraction, maybe it's a place. Maybe it's something that you're not as prepared to deal with because no one told you that it's perfectly fine to understand yourself in terms of landscape. Who knows? So if you practice in this way long enough, if you just let whatever distractions happen form into whatever it is that they sort of, you could say, want to, you do this over and over, you give yourself more and more permission to let this naturally happen. You let the images just evolve over time, they'll get clearer and clearer. They really do. And it becomes really obvious what is happening. And really consistent, in fact. To the point where you can have an image in mind, and then when you sit down next time to meditate, you can go straight to the image, even if it doesn't necessarily feel right immediately, and your mind naturally latches back onto it. It's like you're returning to a project that you're working on. A project of the contents of your own mind. And maybe sometimes you go in and it looks similar, but maybe sometimes it's rainy. There's fog that blurs out some features of it. It feels cold. All the feeling is just tremendously cold. Hey, maybe you're just having a terrible day. Maybe something bad happened. And that's just the emotional weather of your day and your mind at that time. Again, you just can't force it back into a specific image. You just have to let it evolve how it naturally is. And so that's the big advantage of experiencing our minds as a landscape, because a landscape is naturally by itself a very dynamic place. We're all familiar with seasons and weather. This kind of dynamic chaos, ordered chaos, is something that humans have evolved with. It's something that intuitively makes sense to us and that we can accept. And it turns out that when we apply this perspective to our own minds, it works really well to let the natural ebb and flow of our thoughts and feelings to be translated into weather or storms, even if it's bad enough, or seasons, or transformations over time. Who knows? Mind space is a unique. It's different from the physical world because things can happen a lot faster than they can in the physical world. So like in the physical world, mountains will arise and then they'll get worn away and rise up again. But it takes millions of years, and an individual human doesn't see any of that. Well, in the mental world, things can happen instantly. Things can just change. What started out as a familiar landscape might start to change. Maybe some parts, some more stable parts like mountains, will stick around. But where once there was forests, who knows? Maybe now we have a city. Maybe now, if we're honest about what is in our minds, maybe it feels more like a very human landscape. Maybe it just feels intuitively like there's humans around. Maybe if we're feeling less lonely or more connected or whatever. Or it could go exactly the opposite way. Maybe even the mountains themselves will disappear. And we'll think there's nothing there. But then you realize that where we actually are is deep in space. That this space that we had generated, that we had discovered within our minds, is still real and still present, but we are now somewhere else. Perhaps this is where feelings like depression can come from. Sometimes. Perhaps. I don't know. In my case, the most depressive moments have been feeling like I'm disconnected from all the familiar things. But even that can be accepted in the same method. Just recognize, oh, I'm not on planet Earth anymore. Okay, I'm disconnected from all the human things. I'm in a place where humans really shouldn't be, and that's frightening and alarming. But since this is the mind, that's fine. Our minds can wander anywhere in the world and anywhere across the mental universe in the blink of an eye. And I think that is what makes the mind so difficult for us to deal with. I think if the mind was just like the physical world and slow, with just a very familiar number of ordinary things around us, then we'd never have much trouble with the mind. But that's not how it is, at least not for us now. Things can change incredibly quickly. And we find ourselves in much different landscapes with much different things around. And that's alarming. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. I mean, it's something that can be accepted. It's something that we can decide, okay, well, I'm here. And just like with the forests or the cities or the mountains, I can't change it. So might as well try to see like what else is there. And as usual, the answers can be a bit surprising. There might be things there that are not so distant after all. There might be some very curious thoughts and feelings that are in this particular place that if we could just allow ourselves to give form to, perhaps would naturally burst into their own kind of presence. And then, once we are able to see them, then we can engage. I think that's all for now. Next time will be how the landscapes can change when you've visited pretty much everywhere, and how it sort of edges on towards what might be called some level of enlightenment, even. Also, how different, have to look at how different traditions work with these different types of images.